On my birthday, my parents hosted a dinner with 100 relatives just to disown me. My dad handed me a bill, said, "Every cent we wasted raising you. Pay or never contact us again." My sister grabbed my car keys from the table. Dad already transferred the title to me. I walked out without a word. By the next morning, they were calling me 50 times a day. But before I tell you about the silence that finally broke them, I need to tell you about the noise. It started the moment I pulled into the driveway. The gravel crunching under the tires of my sedan was the only unscripted sound in the entire neighborhood. The house loomed ahead, a sprawling colonial structure that looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep imperfections out. The driveway was already lined with luxury SUVs and imported sports cars, a gleaming metal parade that made my practical 5-year-old commuter car look like a dirty mistake. I parked at the very end of the line, near the hedge that needed trimming. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was still in my work clothes, a gray blazer and sensible shoes, having come straight from the office. I took a breath, holding it for 4 seconds, releasing it for 4. That was the rule. Regulate the system. Do not let the error code show. Inside, the house hummed with a low, dangerous vibration. It was the sound of polite conversation, the clink of crystal against crystal, the performative laughter of people who were more concerned with being seen than being happy. My mother, Adalyn, was in the foyer. She did not hug me. She did not say happy birthday. She looked at my shoes, then at my hair, and gave a tight, thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You are late," she said. It was 7:15 in the evening. The invitation said 7. I apologized. I always apologized. It was my role. In this family, I was the fixer, the debugger. The one who quietly handled the messy realities of life so they could maintain the aesthetic. I kept the Wi-Fi running. I balanced the checkbooks when the math got hard, and I stayed out of the photographs. We moved into the dining room. They had set the long mahogany table with the good china, the set with the gold rim that we were never allowed to touch as children. 100 people were not literally at the table, of course, but the room felt full, suffocating with aunts, uncles, and family friends who had known me since I was a toddler. They watched me take my seat. The silence that fell over the room wasn't expectant. It was heavy. I looked for my sister Lena. She was seated at the center of the table, to my father's right. She was glowing, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, holding court with a glass of champagne in her hand. She smiled at me, a sharp, predatory expression that I should have recognized immediately. Then I saw him. Mark, my boss. He was standing near the sideboard, clutching a glass of water like a lifeline. He looked pale, sweating despite the air conditioning. He wouldn't meet my eyes. My stomach turned over. Why was my manager at my family birthday dinner? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe my father, Richard, had invited him to network. Richard believed everyone was a resource to be exploited. But the logic didn't hold. The vibration in the room shifted from awkward to hostile. Halfway through the main course, the performance began. My mother stood up. She didn't tap her glass for a toast. She walked to the wall behind me, where the family gallery hung in a perfect grid. Graduation photos, vacation snapshots, moments frozen in gold leaf. She reached up and took down the only picture of me in the room. It was a small frame. Me at 16, looking sunburned and unsure. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the soft scrape of the hook against the drywall. She placed the photo face down on the sideboard and sat back down. Then my father cleared his throat. He didn't look at me. He looked at the leather folder sitting next to his plate. He slid it across the mahogany table. It moved smoothly, stopping inches from my hand. "Open it," he said. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, itemized, and summed up at the bottom. It wasn't a card. It was a ledger. Dental work, school lunches, clothing, tuition, a lifetime of basic necessities, tallied up to a final number that made my vision blur. Just under $250,000. "This is for accountability," my father said, his voice level, reasonable, the voice of a man closing a deal. "You have been a drain on this family's resources for too long, Adalyn. We are liquidating our bad investment." I looked at the number. I looked at him. I waited for the punchline, for the laughter. For someone to say this was a cruel joke. No one laughed. My Aunt Helen studied her napkin. My Uncle Paul looked at the ceiling. "And since you obviously cannot pay this immediately," my father continued, "we have taken steps to recover some of the value." That was when Lena moved. She didn't rush. She reached out with a manicured hand and picked up a set of keys from the table. My keys. I hadn't even realized they were gone from my purse. She dangled them from one finger, the metal catching the light. The title was in Dad's name. She said, her voice bored, like she was explaining a simple concept to a child. "He signed it over to me this morning. You weren't maintaining it properly anyway." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I looked at Mark. He finally looked up, his face gray. Richard nodded at him. "Go ahead, Mark." Mark cleared his throat, his voice shaking. "Adalyn, based on the information your father provided regarding your instability and the financial irregularities he brought to our attention, we have to let you go. Effective immediately." The room waited. They were waiting for the tears. They were waiting for me to beg, to scream, to fall to my knees, and ask what I had done to deserve this execution. I felt the heat rise in my chest, a wave of pure, unadulterated shock. But then, something clicked. It was the same feeling I got when I looked at a corrupted line of code. The emotion vanished, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't a family. This was a system error. And I was done trying to patch it. I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor. A harsh sound that made my mother flinch. I reached out and took the folder. I didn't look at the bill. I just closed it and tucked it under my arm. I looked at my father, who was smiling now, a look of relief on his face, as if he had finally cut out a tumor. I looked at Lena, playing with my keys. I looked at Mark, who was staring at his shoes. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't ask why. I turned around and walked out of the dining room, through the foyer, and out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. The sound was final. I stood on the porch for a second, listening. No one came after me. No one called my name. I walked down the steps, past the line of luxury cars, past my own car that wasn't mine anymore, and onto the street. I started walking. I had 3 miles to go to get back to my apartment. My feet hurt in my sensible shoes. The night air was cold. But for the first time in 30 years, The silence wasn't heavy. It was mine. The asphalt of the suburban street was rougher than the manicured driveway I had just left. My heels, sensible as they were, clicked a rhythmic, lonely staccato against the pavement. 1 step. 2 steps. Keep moving. That was the command I gave my body. Just keep moving, until the error message in my brain clears. I had walked this route 1,000 times in my head, usually while driving past it on my way to fix a router or troubleshoot a printer for my parents. Now, walking it in the dark, without a car, without a job, and without a family, it felt like I was traversing a foreign planet. The walk was exactly 3.4 miles. I knew the distance because I knew everything about the logistics of my life. It was a habit born of survival. If you know the variables, you can predict the outcome. But I had not predicted this. I walked past the houses of neighbors I had known for decades. The Harrisons had their porch light on. Through the front window, I could see the blue flicker of a television and the silhouette of someone moving toward the kitchen. Probably getting a glass of water. A normal, mundane act in a normal, safe life. Further down, the faint hiss of a sprinkler system started up. A rhythmic ticking that sounded like a metronome counting down time. My feet began to burn after the first mile. By the second mile, the blister on my right heel had burst, a sharp, stinging pain that actually helped ground me. The physical pain was real. It was manageable. It was a sensation I could understand, unlike the hollow, carved-out feeling in my chest. I focused on the mechanics of what had just happened. I dissected it, layer by layer, as I walked. Lena taking the keys. That was the detail that snagged in my mind. She had said the title was transferred that morning. That meant she had gone to the Department of Motor Vehicles. She had stood in line. She had filled out paperwork. She had planned this days, maybe weeks, in advance. This was not a crime of passion. It was a premeditated extraction. A car slowed down as it passed me. The driver likely wondering why a woman in a business suit was walking alone on the shoulder of the road at 8 o'clock at night. I didn't look up. I kept my eyes on the white line painted on the edge of the road. If I looked up, if I made eye contact with kindness, I might shatter. And I could not afford to shatter. I had to remain solid. By the time I reached my apartment complex, my legs were trembling. It was a modest building, a beige block of 12 units on the edge of town, far from the estate section where my parents lived. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs, my hand gripping the cold metal railing. I unlocked my door and stepped inside. The air in my apartment was stale and cool. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I didn't want to see the space. I dropped my bag on the floor and kicked off my shoes. The relief was immediate, but it was followed by a wave of exhaustion, so profound I almost sank to the floor right there. Instead, I walked to my desk. It was a simple setup. A wide monitor, a mechanical keyboard, a high-performance laptop. This was my cockpit. This was the only place in the world where the rules made sense. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and pressed the power button. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, blue glow across the room. It was the only light I needed. I reached into my bag and pulled out the leather folder. It sat on my desk, heavy and ominous. It looked like a menu from an expensive restaurant, the kind where they don't print the prices. But the price was all that was inside. I opened it. My father's handwriting was absent. It was a spreadsheet, printed on heavy, cream-colored bond paper. I ran my finger down the columns. It was meticulous. It was insane. Item 1. Private press school, 1998. $4,200. Item 2. Summer camp, 2001. $1,500. Item 3. Piano lessons. 2003 through 2006. $3,000. I stopped at that one. I hated piano. I had begged to quit for 3 years. My mother had insisted I continue, because it looked good when guests came over. They were charging me for the hours I had spent being a prop in their living room. I turned the page. It continued. Clothing. School lunches. A prorated share of the mortgage for the 18 years I lived under their roof. It was formatted like a corporate invoice. Terms, immediate. I stared at the final number. $248,750. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly. The shock began to recede, replaced by the cold, analytical part of my brain. The part that hunted for patterns. Why this? Why now? If they just wanted to disown me, they could have just changed the locks. They could have stopped calling. But they didn't. They staged a show. They brought witnesses. They fired me. I closed my eyes and visualized the board. Piece 1, they strip my assets. My car. Piece 2, they destroy my income. My job. Piece 3, they present a debt I cannot possibly pay. If I was just a disappointment, they would have exiled me. But you don't bill an exile. You bill a debtor. They didn't want me gone. They wanted me broken. They knew I had savings, but not $250,000. They knew that without a job and a car, I would burn through my emergency fund in months. And when that was gone, and this debt was hanging over my head, what was the logical conclusion? Bankruptcy. Desperation. They wanted me to lose everything, so that I would have to crawl back. Not as a daughter, but as a servant. They wanted their fixer back, but they wanted her at a discount. They wanted to strip me of the one thing I valued, more than their approval, my independence. I looked at the folder again. It wasn't a bill. It was a siege weapon. My mother's voice echoed in my head. You are late. My father's voice. Bad investment. Lena's voice. Dad already transferred the title. They thought they had checkmated me. They thought I was a piece on the board that could be captured and put back in the box until needed. I opened my eyes. I looked at the blinking cursor on my screen. The blue light reflected in my pupils. They forgot who they were dealing with. I wasn't just the quiet girl who fixed the Wi-Fi. I was a senior analyst for a cybersecurity firm. I didn't just fix systems. I broke them down to see how they worked. I found the vulnerabilities. I found the rot. My sadness evaporated, leaving behind something harder, sharper. Something useful. I cracked my knuckles. The sound was loud in the quiet apartment. If they wanted a transaction, I would give them one. But first, I needed to see their books. I needed to see what they were hiding. Because people who are financially secure do not present their children with invoices for school lunches. I reached for the keyboard. It was time to go to work. My fingers found the home row keys instinctively. The silence of the apartment was quickly replaced by the rapid fire clatter of mechanical switches. A sound that had always soothed me. It was the sound of productivity, of problems being dismantled one keystroke at a time. I did not have to break into anything. That was the irony my father had overlooked in his grand plan to excommunicate me. For 10 years, I had been the unofficial IT department for the entire family. I had set up the routers, configured the firewalls, and, crucially, installed the password manager they all used because they could never remember their logins. I was the administrator. They were just users. And users never think to revoke admin privileges until it is too late. I opened a terminal window. The black screen with its crisp white text felt like a clean room, sterile and honest. I typed in the master credentials for the family vault. I half expected access to be denied, for Lena or my father to have changed the master key. But the dashboard loaded instantly. Of course it did. Changing the password would require technical competence. Or at least the foresight to know that the daughter you just fired held the keys to your digital kingdom. I started with the primary checking account. This was the account my father used to pay for the country club, the landscapers, and the wine cellar. I queried the balance. The number that flashed on the screen made me blink. I leaned closer, assuming I had misread a decimal point. $4,312.42. I sat back, frowning. That was impossible. My father, Richard, constantly bragged about liquidity. He spoke of wealth as if it were a natural resource he had drilled in the backyard. A man who throws a dinner party for 100 people with catered service and top-shelf liquor does not have $4,000 in his operating account. I dug deeper. I pulled up the credit card statements. Red. Everything was in the red. The platinum card was maxed out at $50,000. The gold card was hovering near its limit. The interest payments alone were staggering, amounting to more than my monthly rent. I switched windows to look at the mortgage. The house, the sprawling estate with the long driveway, and the perfectly trimmed hedges, was supposed to be paid off. My father had made a toast at Christmas 5 years ago, celebrating the final payment. I remembered it clearly. He had burned a photocopy of the deed in the fireplace while we all applauded. I accessed the bank records for the property. There was a second mortgage, and a third, and a home equity line of credit that had been drained dry. The timestamp on the third mortgage was from 6 months ago. The principal amount was massive. Where did that money go? I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't satisfaction. It was vertigo. The solid ground of my childhood, the belief that my family was powerful and secure, was dissolving into pixels. They weren't rich. They were drowning. They were leveraging debt to pay off other debt, to maintain the illusion of solvency. I picked up the leather folder from the desk and flipped it open to the summary page. $248,000. I looked at the screen again. I pulled up the amortization schedule for the second mortgage. A balloon payment was due in 14 days. The amount due was exactly $250,000. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. This wasn't a punishment. This wasn't about teaching me a lesson in responsibility or settling a moral debt. It was a shakedown. They needed $250,000 in 2 weeks to keep the bank from foreclosing on the house. They didn't have it. Their credit was shot. They had tapped every line of equity they owned. So they looked at me. The reliable one. The one with the steady career in tech. the one who lived frugally, the one who never asked for anything. They assumed I had savings. They assumed that if they squeezed me hard enough, if they threatened me with exile, I would panic and liquidate my 401k or take out a personal loan to buy my way back into their good graces. They were trying to use me to pay the mortgage on a house I wasn't even welcome in. My stomach churned. I pushed the keyboard away and stood up, pacing the small length of my living room. It was predatory. It was desperate. But it still didn't explain everything. Even with the mortgage and the credit cards, the math didn't fully align. My father was a high-earning consultant. Or at least he claimed to be. Lena had a trust fund from our grandmother. There should have been inflows of cash to offset the bleeding. I went back to the desk. I needed to see the flow. Money doesn't just vanish, it moves. I accessed the transaction history for the past 24 months and exported the data into a visualization tool. I watched the lines of code turn into a graph. It looked like a heart rate monitor on a dying patient. Spikes of cash coming in, followed immediately by massive hemorrhages going out. But the incoming transfers were strange. They weren't payroll deposits. They weren't consulting fees. They were personal wire transfers. I highlighted the source of the funds. Uncle Paul. Aunt Helen. My grandmother's estate trust. The labels on the deposits were innocuous. Investment capital. Portfolio management. Bridge loan. My father was taking money from his own siblings. I felt a cold sweat prickle on the back of my neck. Uncle Paul was a retired schoolteacher. Aunt Helen ran a bakery. They were comfortable, but they weren't wealthy. They trusted Richard because he was the successful brother, the financier, the man with the big house. I tracked one specific deposit from Uncle Paul. $50,000, sent 3 months ago. The memo line ready for the tech start-up fund. I tracked where that money went. It hit my father's account on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, $45,000 was transferred out. I followed the trail. It didn't go to a tech start-up. It didn't go to a brokerage account. It went to a luxury car dealership. I cross-referenced the date. 3 months ago. That was the week Lena posted a photo on Instagram of her new convertible. Caption: Dad treats me like a princess. I stared at the screen. My mouth dry. He wasn't investing their money. He was spending it. He was running a Ponzi scheme with his own family to fund Lena's lifestyle and keep up appearances. And now, the walls were closing in. The relatives were probably expecting returns. The bank was expecting the mortgage payment. And the well was dry. I was the exit strategy. If they could extract $250,000 from me, they could plug the hole in the dam for another few months. My phone buzzed on the desk. I ignored it. I was in the flow state now, that hyper-focused zone where time ceases to exist and only data matters. I needed proof. Hard proof. A graph was one thing, but I needed the smoking gun. I needed to find where they kept the real records. The ones that showed they knew exactly what they were doing. I remembered an old shared drive my father used to use for tax documents. He hadn't updated the permissions in years. I navigated to the cloud storage, typing in a password I hadn't used since college. Access granted. I scanned the folders, tax returns, deeds, wills, and then a folder simply labeled L expense. I double-clicked it. Hundreds of files, PDF receipts, invoices. It was a catalog of consumption, First class flights to Paris, designer handbags, spa retreats, all tagged with Lena's name. But the most damning file was a spreadsheet at the very bottom, modified just yesterday. It was titled, Liquidity Strategy. I opened it. It was a timeline. Phase 1, transfer title of Camry to Lena. Phase 2, terminate Adalyn's employment to induce financial panic. Phase 3, present retroactive invoice. Phase 4, collection. They had written it down. They had actually planned my destruction in a spreadsheet. I sat there in the blue glow of the monitor, the silence of the room pressing against my ears. I wasn't a daughter to them. I wasn't even a person. I was an asset to be liquidated. I saved the file. Then I backed it up to an encrypted external drive. Then I backed it up again to a secure cloud server. The sun was starting to creep through the blinds, painting gray stripes across the floor. I hadn't slept, but I wasn't tired. I felt a cold, terrifying energy coursing through me. I picked up my phone. No missed calls from my parents yet. They were probably sleeping soundly. Confident that their plan was working, confident that I was currently crying in my pillow, wondering how to scrape together the money to buy their love back. I looked at the contact for my Uncle Paul. I could burn it all down. I could send one email and destroy their reputation, their finances, and their freedom. But not yet. First, I had to secure my own perimeter. I had to get my job back. I closed the laptop lid. The room plunged back into semi-darkness. Phase 4 was collection. They were right about that. But they had the direction of the payment wrong. I wasn't going to pay them. They were going to pay for everything. The sun rose over the city in a wash of pale, indifferent gray. It filtered through the cheap blinds of my apartment, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. I watched them for a moment, my hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee that had long since gone cold. I had not slept. The adrenaline that had fueled my excavation of the family finances had burned off, leaving behind a brittle, vibrating exhaustion. But my mind was clear, crystal clear. On my monitor, the evidence was arranged in neat, damning rows. I had spent the last 3 hours moving from discovery to organization. Finding the fraud was one thing, presenting it was another. I needed to build a narrative that was undeniable. I needed to translate the raw data of bank transfers and credit card statements into a story that even my grandmother, who still wrote checks at the grocery store, could understand. I called the file the audit. I began to categorize the theft. That was what it was. Theft. I created a folder for Uncle Paul. I dragged and dropped the PDF of the wire transfer he had sent for the tech start-up. Next to it, I placed the invoice from the luxury dealership for Lena's convertible. The dates matched perfectly. The amounts matched perfectly. It was a straight line from his retirement savings to her vanity. I created a folder for Aunt Helen. She had sent $10,000 last Christmas, believing it was going into a college fund for a non-existent cousin. I traced the money. It had been used to pay for a catering deposit. Specifically, the catering for the New Year's Eve party, where my father had bragged about his stock portfolio. He had used her money to pay for the audience. He needed to lie to her. The cruelty of it made my stomach twist. These were people who loved him. People who had known him his entire life. He had weaponized their trust to maintain a facade of success. And he had done it with a casual, administrative efficiency that was terrifying. My phone buzzed on the desk. I flinched. The sound was like a physical blow in the quiet room. I looked at the screen. It was 6:15 in the morning. "Mom," I didn't answer. The phone vibrated for 30 seconds, then fell silent. A moment later, a text message appeared. "Adalyn, where are you? We are worried. Please call us. We can work this out." I stared at the words. A day ago, I would have read them as genuine concern. I would have heard my mother's voice, anxious and peacemaking, trying to bridge the gap between me and my father. I would have felt guilty for making her worry. But now, I had the spreadsheet. I clicked back to the liquidity strategy file I had found on the shared drive. I scrolled down to Phase 4 collection. There was a sub, heading Client Retention. Bullet point 1, isolate the subject. Bullet point 2, apply pressure via termination of employment. Bullet point 3, if subject resists, initiate compassionate outreach to re-establish contact. My mother wasn't worried. She was executing bullet point 3. The text wasn't a message from a parent. It was a notification from a system trying to acquire a lost asset. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Lena. "Stop being dramatic, Adalyn. Pick up the phone. Dad is willing to set up a payment plan for you. He is being really generous considering how you embarrassed us last night." Generous. I looked at the photo of her convertible on my screen. I looked at the 3 mortgages on the house she lived in rent-free. I looked at the $250,000 debt they were trying to hang around my neck to save themselves from foreclosure. My hands, which had been trembling slightly from the caffeine and the lack of sleep, went still. I wasn't just angry. I was offended. I was offended by the sloppiness of it. Did they really think I was this stupid? Did they really think that after 30 years of watching me fix their mistakes, of watching me untangle their technical messes, I wouldn't notice when they tried to reprogram my reality? I set the mug down on the coaster. I needed to get ready. I walked into the bathroom and turned on the shower. I stood under the spray until the water turned cold, washing away the smell of the dinner party, the smell of the old house, the smell of fear. I scrubbed my skin until it was pink and raw. When I stepped out, I didn't put on my sweatpants. I didn't put on the comfortable clothes of the unemployed. I put on my best suit. It was a sharp, navy blue blazer and tailored trousers. I put on the silk blouse I usually saved for client presentations. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe bun. I applied my makeup with precision. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back didn't look like a victim. She looked like an auditor. She looked like someone who was about to deliver bad news. I walked back to my desk. The phone was buzzing again. My father this time. "Adalyn. Answer me. We need to settle this account." He was right. We did need to settle the account. But he had miscalculated the balance. I sat down and opened a new email draft. I wasn't going to reply to them. Engaging with the user is a waste of time when the system is compromised. You don't argue with a virus. You isolate it. You bypass it. I needed my access restored. I needed my credentials back. And I knew exactly who held the real keys to my career. Mark, my boss, was a middle manager. He was weak. He had fired me because he was afraid of my father's influence, afraid of the social pressure of that dinner party. But Mark reported to someone else. Sarah Jenkins. The regional director. She was a woman who didn't care about dinner parties. She cared about uptime. She cared about security. She cared about data. And I had a lot of data. I attached the employment contract I had signed 5 years ago. I attached the performance reviews that Mark had signed, all glowing, all rating me as exceeding expectations. And then, I attached a second file. It was a log of the incident. Not an emotional diary entry, but a factual timeline. 1900 hours. Private event attended by Mark within scope of personal relationship with Richard. 100 hours. Verbal termination issued by Mark without human resources presence or documentation. Context. Termination followed immediately after a family financial dispute in which Richard demanded $250,000. I titled the email, Wrongful Termination and Conflict of Interest. I hovered my mouse over the send button. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was the point of no return. Once I sent this, I was declaring war. Not just on my family, but on the version of myself that had protected them for so long. The version of me that stayed quiet. I looked at the text from my mother again. We can work this out. No, Mom. I thought. We can't. I pressed the return key. The response to my declaration of war did not come instantly. Real wars, the kind fought in boardrooms and server farms, rarely begin with an explosion. They begin with a period of assessment. I sat in my ergonomic chair, my spine pressed against the mesh back, watching the inbox of my personal email account. I had sent the message to Sarah Jenkins at 7:20 in the morning. She was an early riser. I knew this because I had seen her timestamp on system logs. She was usually online by 6:30, scanning the network health reports before her first coffee. 7:30 passed. Then 7:35. The silence in the apartment was heavy. But it was different from the silence of the night before. That silence had been filled with dread. This silence was filled with anticipation. It was the silence of a fuse burning down. My phone buzzed again. My mother. Another text. Adalyn, please. We are a family. We do not air our dirty laundry. Mark is just doing what is best for the company. Do not make this worse. I swiped the notification away without reading the rest. They were terrified. They knew that if I pulled on the thread of my employment, the whole sweater would unravel. They relied on Mark's silence as much as they relied on mine. At 7:42, my phone rang. It wasn't my mother. It wasn't Lena. The caller ID displayed a number I recognized, but one that had never called my personal cell before. Regional office. I took a breath, held it for 4 seconds, released it for 4. I picked up the phone. This is Adalyn. Adalyn, this is Sarah Jenkins. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it from the quarterly all-hands meetings. Dry, crisp, and completely devoid of unnecessary warmth. It was a voice that commanded attention, not by raising its volume, but by lowering the temperature of the room. Good morning, Sarah, I said. My voice did not shake. I was on my own turf now. This was business. I received your email, she said. I have read the attachments. I have also just finished a very interesting, albeit brief, conversation with Mark. I waited. The rule of power dynamics is simple. He who speaks first loses. I let the silence stretch over the line, a vast, open space that Mark would have frantically tried to fill with excuses. Sarah filled it with a sigh. Mark has been placed on administrative Leave pending an internal investigation, she said. Her tone suggested that Mark was a mild inconvenience. She was scraping off her shoe. It appears there were some significant lapses in protocol regarding your termination. Specifically, the lack of documentation, the lack of cause, and the rather glaring conflict of interest regarding his personal relationship with your father. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The validation hit me harder than the adrenaline. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't incompetent. I was just surrounded by liars. Thank you, Sarah, I said. I appreciate you looking into it so quickly. Do not thank me, she said sharply. This is a liability nightmare. I am cleaning up a mess. Your access has been restored effective immediately. I want you to take the rest of the week off. Paid. Consider it a cooling off period while legal sorts out the paperwork. I expect you back online on Monday. Understood, I said. And Adalyn. Yes. If anyone from your family contacts you regarding company business again, you direct them to me. Do not engage. Is that clear? Crystal, I said. Good. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. I stared at the blank screen for a moment, letting the reality settle in. I had won. It had taken less than an hour. I had dismantled the professional blockade my father had spent days constructing. He thought he could use Mark as a pawn to crush me. But he forgot that in the corporate world, pawns are sacrificed the moment they become liabilities. My father had influence in the country, club dining room. Sarah Jenkins had influence in the real world. I turned back to my monitor. I refreshed my email. A notification from the IT department popped up. Access restoration confirmation. I logged into the company VPN. The familiar dashboard greeted me. My calendar, my projects, my code repositories. It was all there. I was still Adalyn, the senior analyst. I was still employed. I was still solvent. And that meant I didn't need their $250,000. I felt a smile tug at the corner of my mouth. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a hunter who realizes the trap has sprung. I had secured my perimeter. My shield was back in place. Now, it was time to pick up the sword. I minimized the work window and maximized the folder I had named the audit. I had the raw data. I had the bank transfers, the credit card statements, the mortgage documents. But raw data is boring. People don't read spreadsheets. They read stories. I opened a new document. I began to compile the final report. I didn't write it like a diary. I wrote it like a forensic analysis. Section 1. The Trust Fund. I dragged in the files regarding Uncle Paul's money. I created a simple side-by-side comparison. On the left, the wire transfer from Paul labeled investment. On the right, the invoice for the luxury convertible. I highlighted the dates in red. Section 2. The charity. I dragged in the files regarding Aunt Helen. On the left, her check for the college fund. On the right, the catering bill for the New Year's Eve party. I added a note. Note the consumption of premium champagne, billed to the education account. Section 3. The solvency. I added the mortgage statements. I added the foreclosure warnings. I added the credit card balances. I created a summary page. It was a single paragraph, written in plain, brutal English. Dear family, I am writing to clarify the financial request made of me at the dinner last night. I was asked to pay $250,000 to cover the cost of my upbringing. Upon review of the family accounts, It appears this sum is actually required to cover the balloon payment on a third mortgage, which is currently in default. Furthermore, the funds entrusted to Richard for investment purposes by extended family members have been reallocated to personal lifestyle expenses. Attached is the full accounting of these reallocations. I saved the document as a PDF. I named it Financial Discrepancies Report. I opened my email client. I didn't use my work email. I used my personal one. I clicked Compose. In the recipient field, I didn't just type my father's name. I typed everyone: Uncle Paul, Aunt Helen, my grandparents, the cousins, even the few family friends who had been at the dinner and witnessed my humiliation. The distribution list contained 42 email addresses. I attached the PDF. My finger hovered over the mouse button. The cursor was a small white arrow pointing at the word send. This was the nuclear option. Once I clicked this, there was no going back. I would be burning the bridge, the house, and the entire land it stood on. I would be the villain in their story forever. The ungrateful daughter who ruined the family name. But then I remembered the sound of the hook scraping against the drywall as my mother took down my picture. I remembered the weight of the leather folder sliding across the table. I remembered Lena spinning my car keys on her finger. Bored and victorious. They had already burned the bridge. I was just lighting up the wreckage, so everyone could see what really happened. I didn't hesitate. I clicked send. The progress bar flashed once, a thin blue line racing across the top of the screen, and then it was gone. The message sent notification appeared briefly in the bottom corner, before fading away, leaving the white screen of my inbox staring back at me. It was done. I sat back in my chair, my hands falling into my lap. I expected to feel panic. I expected the sudden, crushing weight of regret that usually follows an impulsive decision. But this wasn't impulsive. It was the result of 8 hours of forensic auditing and 30 years of being the invisible, dutiful daughter. I didn't feel panic. I felt a strange, hollow lightness, like gravity had momentarily lost its hold on the room. The silence in the apartment stretched out. 1 minute. 2 minutes. I picked up my coffee mug. It was empty, a ring of brown stain at the bottom, but I held it anyway. Grounding myself in the physical world, while the digital one carried my payload across the city. I imagined the data packets traveling through the fiber optic cables buried under the streets. I imagined them arriving at the servers, being sorted, and then delivered to the inboxes of 42 people. Uncle Paul checked his email on his tablet with his morning toast. Aunt Helen used her phone. My cousins were probably at work, seeing the notification pop up on their secondary screens. 3 minutes. My phone buzzed on the desk, startling me so badly, I nearly dropped the mug. I looked at the screen, my heart hammering a sudden, violent rhythm against my ribs. I expected it to be my father, screaming. It was a text message from Lena. The timestamp was 1 minute after I had sent the email. She hadn't seen it yet. She was likely still asleep. Or just waking up in her room with the silk sheets, reaching for her phone to send a demand. Before she even brushed her teeth. I picked up the phone and read the message. Dad is losing patience, Adalyn. He says if the transfer isn't initiated by noon, he is calling his lawyer to sue you for the rest. Don't be selfish. You have the money. Just pay it so we can go back to normal. I stared at the words. Don't be selfish. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, dry and sharp. It was such a perfect, crystalline distillation of her worldview. To Lena, my savings account wasn't my property. It was a family resource she hadn't tapped yet. My refusal to bankrupt myself to fund her convertible wasn't self-preservation, it was selfishness. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The irony was about to hit her with the force of a freight train. 5 minutes. The first reaction didn't come to me directly. It appeared on my second monitor, where I had kept the family bank portal open. I had administrator access, which meant I could see everything in real time. I watched the dashboard. At 8:05 in the morning, a login attempt was flagged on the main account. The IP address belonged to Uncle Paul. I leaned forward. He was reading the email. He was seeing the PDF. He was looking at the side-by-side comparison of his investment transfer and the dealership invoice. And now, he was checking the bank to see if it was true. He wouldn't be able to see the details I could see, but he would see the balance, $4,000. 2 minutes later, another login. Aunt Helen. The dashboard blinked as multiple users tried to access the system simultaneously. The system wasn't built for this kind of traffic. It was a family trust, not a public website. Then, the phone calls started. My cell phone lit up. It wasn't my parents. It was my cousin, David. He was a lawyer in the city, the son of Aunt Helen. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. Then Uncle Paul called. Then Aunt Helen. I watched the phone vibrate, dancing across the wooden surface of the desk. I turned it over, silencing the ringer, but the buzzing continued. It was a relentless, angry insect. 10 minutes. Finally, the call I had been waiting for. Dad. The name flashed on the screen. Demanding attention. I could picture him in the kitchen, perhaps holding a slice of melon, his phone pressed to his ear. His face turning that dangerous shade of purple. He wouldn't be calling to apologize. He would be calling to command. He would be calling to tell me to fix it, to tell everyone it was a mistake, a hack, a prank. I didn't answer. The call ended. Immediately, it rang again, Dad, and again, Dad, then Lena, then Mom. The notifications stacked up on the lock screen, a cascading waterfall of panic. Missed call, voicemail, text message ANSWRTOME, text message WHAT DIDU duo, text message EOUN Giraffuel Borat. I sat in the eye of the hurricane, watching the storm wall rotate around me. I turned my attention back to the banking dashboard. This was the kill screen. This was where the war would be decided. At 8:15, a notification appeared in red text at the top of the browser window. Alert: suspicious activity detected. Then another. Alert: transfer limit exceeded. And then, the one I knew was coming. The one that signaled the end of the empire. Status change. Account frozen pending investigation. I let out a long, slow breath. Uncle Paul had called the bank. Or maybe David, the lawyer, had done it. They had reported the fraud. They had told the bank that the funds in the account were stolen, or misused, or at risk. The bank, operating on algorithms designed to minimize liability, had slammed the brakes on everything. The credit cards would be next. I switched tabs to the credit card portal. I refreshed the page. Your account has been temporarily suspended. Please contact customer service. It was happening. The house of cards wasn't just wobbling, it was disintegrating. Without access to the credit lines, they couldn't buy groceries. They couldn't put gas in the SUVs. They couldn't pay the caterers for the next party. And most importantly, they couldn't pay the mortgage. The $250,000 they needed from me was irrelevant now. Even if I gave it to them. The accounts were locked. The bank wouldn't accept a check from a frozen asset pool. The foreclosure clock wasn't just ticking. It was accelerating. My phone was still buzzing. It had moved 3 inches across the desk from the vibration alone. I picked it up and looked at the call log. 17 missed calls in 12 minutes. This was what I had mentioned in the opening of my story. By the next morning, they were calling me 50 times a day. But it started right then, in that first hour. The desperation was palpable. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was terror. They were realizing that I wasn't the fixer anymore. I was the demolition crew. I opened the text thread with my father. I didn't read his messages. I just typed one single line. I told you that every action has a cost. This is yours. I hit send. Then I put the phone on Do Not Disturb. I stood up and walked to the window. The sun was fully up now, bathing the parking lot of my apartment complex in bright, revealing light. It was a normal Tuesday for everyone else. People were getting into their cars, driving to work, listening to the radio. They had no idea that in a digital cloud above their heads, a dynasty was burning to the ground. I felt a sudden pang of hunger. I realized I hadn't eaten since lunch the day before. The dinner party had been served, but I hadn't taken a single bite before the folder was slid across the table. I walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. It was mostly empty, just a carton of milk, some eggs, and a leftover container of pasta. I took out the pasta and ate it cold, standing at the counter. It tasted like freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about how my actions would reflect on the family. I wasn't worried about managing my mother's emotions or my father's ego. I was only worried about the pasta being a little dry. I finished the bowl and washed it. When I returned to the living room, the atmosphere had changed. The phone had stopped buzzing, which was suspicious. I looked at the dashboard again. The accounts were still frozen. The emails were still out there. Nothing had been undone. So why the silence? Then I heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong in my complex. The cars here were practical. Sedans, hatchbacks, the occasional 10-year-old pickup truck. The sound approaching from the street was the deep, throaty roar of a high-performance engine. A German engine. A V8 engine that cost more than my entire education. I walked to the window and looked down through the blinds. A black luxury SUV tore into the parking lot. Taking the turn so fast, the tires screeched against the asphalt. It didn't park in a spot. It pulled up directly onto the curb in front of my building, blocking the walkway. The driver's door flew open. My father stepped out. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His tie was undone. His face, even from 3 stories up, was a mask of red fury. He looked disheveled. Frantic, a man who had lost control of his narrative and was looking for something physical to break. He looked up at my window. He knew exactly which unit was mine. I had installed his GPS tracker on his phone myself, for safety, he had said. Now, he was using it to hunt me. He slammed the car door shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet morning. He marched toward the building entrance. My intercom buzzed a second later. A long, angry, continuous press. I didn't answer it. I stepped back from the window. My hands were shaking again, but not from fear. From adrenaline. The digital war was over. I had won that. But now, the war was at my door. I walked to the front door of my apartment. I checked the deadbolt. It was engaged. I checked the chain. I slid it into place. The sound of heavy footsteps pounded on the stairs. He wasn't waiting for the elevator. He was running up the 3 flights. Thud, thud, thud. Each step was a promise of violence. Not physical violence, perhaps. My father wasn't a hitter. He was a shouter. But emotional violence. He was coming to scream me into submission. He was coming to use his physical presence, his volume, his authority to force me back into the box. He reached the landing. He didn't knock. He pounded on the door with his fist, 3 hard, fast blows that made the frame rattle. "Adalyn! Open this door! Open it right now!" His voice was raw. He was shouting loud enough for the neighbors to hear. He didn't care about appearances anymore. The mask had fully slipped. I stood in the center of my living room, watching the door vibrate. I had spent my whole life opening doors for him. Opening accounts, opening opportunities, opening myself up to be criticized and used. I took a step closer. "No," I whispered to the empty room. "Adalyn! I know you are in there! You have ruined us! Open the door and fix this? Fix this." That was the command. That was always the command. I looked at the folder on my desk. I looked at the computer screen with the frozen accounts. I walked right up to the door. I could hear his heavy breathing on the other side. He was inches away, separated only by a piece of wood and a cheap metal lock. "I am not opening the door, Dad," I said. My voice was calm, steady, loud enough for him to hear, but quiet enough that I didn't have to scream. "You listen to me!" he roared. "You are going to call the bank. You are going to tell them it was a mistake. You are going to tell your uncle you were confused. Do you hear me? You are going to fix this?" I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door. "I did fix it," I said. "I fixed the error in the system." "What are you talking about?" "Open the door." I stepped back. "Go home, Dad," I said. "Go home and explain to your wife why you spent her retirement on a convertible." There was a moment of silence, then a sound of pure, inarticulate rage. A kick against the bottom of the door that made the wood splinter slightly. But I didn't flinch. Because for the first time, the monster wasn't in the room with me. He was outside. And I had the key. The kick against the door had been violent. A dull thud that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. But silence followed it. A heavy, gasping silence that was more terrifying than the shouting. I stood there, 3 feet from the barrier, watching the wood around the deadbolt. It held. The cheap metal plate, painted over a dozen times by landlords who didn't care about aesthetics, held fast against the rage of a man who wore Italian loafers and believed the world bent to his will. I could hear him breathing. It was a wet, ragged sound, the sound of a man who had run up 3 flights of stairs, carrying the weight of a crumbling empire on his back. "Adalyn," he said. His voice had dropped. The volume was gone, replaced by a low, menacing intensity. "I know you are in there. I can see your shadow under the door." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I was calibrating. For 30 years, my father's voice had been a command code. When he spoke, I executed. When he was angry, I apologized. When he broke something, I fixed it. The urge to open the door, to soothe him, to promise I would make the bad numbers go away, was a physical ache in my chest. It was muscle memory. It was the survival instinct of a child living in a house where love was conditional on performance. But I wasn't a child anymore. And I wasn't his employee. I walked to the door. I moved slowly, deliberately. I reached out and touched the cold brass of the chain lock. I checked it twice. It was solid. I unlocked the deadbolt. The click was loud in the quiet apartment. I turned the handle and pulled the door open. It moved 4 inches before the chain caught, snapping taut with a metallic clink. Through the narrow gap, I saw him. Richard. My father. The man who had sat at the head of the mahogany table, just last night, looking like a king. He looked ruined. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson. His silver hair, usually gelled into an immovable helmet of dignity, was wild, a strand falling over his forehead. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the damp skin of his neck. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They were wide, frantic, darting around the hallway, as if looking for an exit, or perhaps looking for the audience he was so used to performing for. He saw me through the crack and lunged. His hand slammed against the door, trying to force it open, but the chain held. The door juddered against the frame, hitting my shoulder, but I didn't step back. I planted my feet. "Let me in," he hissed. "No," I said. He stared at me. I think it was the first time in his life he had heard me say that word without a qualifier. "No, I can't. No, I shouldn't. Just, no. You ungrateful little," he started, but the insult died in his throat. He looked past me, into the apartment, as if checking to see if anyone else was there. "We need to talk. Face to face. Now." "We are talking," I said. "This is not a conversation. You have destroyed us, Adalyn. Do you have any idea what you have done?" Paul called me. He called the police, Adalyn. My own brother called the police on me. His voice rose on the last word, cracking into a desperate squeak. I watched him. I observed the sweat beading on his upper lip. I observed the way his hands were shaking, not with strength, but with tremors. "He called the police because you stole from him, Dad," I said. I kept my voice low, flat, devoid of the emotion he wanted to provoke. He wanted a screaming match. He wanted drama. I gave him data. "I didn't steal," he shouted. He slammed his hand against the doorframe again. "It was leverage. It was temporary. I was moving funds to cover the liquidity gap until the deal closed." "You don't understand high finance, Adalyn. You fix computers. You don't understand how the world works." "I understand math," I said. "I understand that you took $50,000 from a retired schoolteacher and bought a convertible for a daughter who doesn't have a job. That isn't finance. That is theft." He flinched. The truth hit him like a physical blow. He pulled his hand back from the door and ran it through his hair, a nervous, jerky motion. "We did it for the family," he pleaded, switching tactics instantly. The anger evaporated, replaced by a wheedling, pathetic earnestness. "That car, appearance matters, Adalyn. You know that. Lena needed to look successful to attract the right kind of suitor. The house. We couldn't lose the house. It's your legacy. It's what we were building for you." "For me?" I asked. "Yes! Everything I do is for you girls. To give you a name that means something. To give you a standing in this world." I looked at him. I really looked at him. I saw the desperation in his eyes, the absolute, terrifying belief that he was the hero of this story. He truly believed that defrauding his siblings and bankrupting his daughter was a noble sacrifice for the sake of the family image. "You didn't do it for me," I said. "You invoiced me. That was a lesson," he snapped, the anger flaring back up. "You needed to learn responsibility. You were coasting, Adalyn. Living in this dump." He gestured vaguely at my apartment door. "We wanted you to step up, to contribute, to be part of the team." I reached into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against the folded piece of paper I had printed out 10 minutes ago. "I am stepping up," I said. I pulled the paper out. It was a single sheet. On it, I had printed the summary of the audit. The total amount he had embezzled. The total amount of debt he had leveraged against the family name. And at the bottom, in bold text, the cost of my silence. 0. I slid the paper through the crack in the door. He looked at it, confused. He didn't take it at first. "Take it," I said. He snatched the paper from my hand. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the lines. I watched his face pale. I watched the blood drain from his cheeks as he read the itemized list of his crimes. "What is this?" he whispered. "That is your bill," I said. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing. "You want me to pay this?" he asked, his voice trembling. I don't have this kind of money, Adalyn. The accounts are frozen." "You know they are frozen! You froze them!" I shook my head. "I don't want your money, Dad. I want you to understand. You handed me a bill for raising me. You put a price tag on my childhood. You told me that love was a transaction." I leaned closer to the crack in the door. I could smell his cologne, a scent that used to smell like authority, now just smelling like stale alcohol and fear. "So I audited the transaction," I said. "And it turns out, you are insolvent." He crumpled the paper in his fist. "You are my daughter," he said, his voice breaking. "You are supposed to help me. You are supposed to fix this." "I am not your fixer," I said. "I am your auditor." I started to close the door. "Wait," he screamed. He jammed his foot into the gap, his expensive leather shoe blocking the path. "Adalyn, please! If you don't call the bank, if you don't retract that email, I will go to prison. Do you hear me? Your father will go to prison." I looked down at his shoe. It was polished to a mirror shine. It was a shoe bought with Aunt Helen's retirement money. I looked back up at his face. Tears were streaming down his cheeks now. Real tears. Tears of a man who realized the walls were not just closing but crushing him. I thought about the 16-year-old girl in the photo he had watched my mother take down. I thought about the girl who had spent her life trying to be quiet enough, useful enough, perfect enough to earn a place at that mahogany table. I thought about the silence I had lived in for 30 years. "You taught me that every action has a cost," I said softly. "Please," he sobbed. "Adalyn, please. This is yours," I said. I kicked his foot. I didn't kick it hard, just a sharp, calculated tap against the toe of his shoe. It was enough. The shock made him recoil. He pulled his foot back instinctively. I slammed the door. I threw the deadbolt. Click. I heard a sound from the other side. A howl. It wasn't a word. It was a raw, animal noise of despair. Then, the sound of a body sliding down the wood. A heavy slump. He was sitting on my doormat. My father, the titan of industry, the patriarch. was sitting on the dirty floor of a third-floor walk-up hallway, weeping into his hands. I stood there for a long time. I watched the door. I waited for the guilt to come. I waited for the voice in my head to tell me I was a bad daughter, that I had gone too far, that I should open the door and comfort him. But the voice didn't come. Instead, I heard the sound of a door opening down the hall. A neighbor, finally brave enough to check on the disturbance. "Excuse me," a voice called out. "Sir, you can't sit there. I'm calling the police." I heard my father scramble to his feet. I heard the scuff of leather on carpet. I heard him mutter something incoherent. And then I heard footsteps retreating. Not the heavy, pounding footsteps of the man who had run up the stairs to conquer me. These were shuffling, uneven steps. The steps of a defeated man. I listened until the heavy fire door at the end of the hall clicked shut. Silence returned to the apartment. I let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in my lungs since I was 6 years old. My knees felt weak, so I leaned my back against the door, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor, mirroring the position my father had just been in. But I wasn't crying. I looked at my hands. They were steady. I looked around my apartment. It was small. It was rented. The furniture was cheap, but it was mine. The lights were on because I paid the electric bill. The internet worked because I configured the router. The air I was breathing was free. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the refrigerator. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The monster was gone. And he hadn't taken me with him. The fallout did not arrive with sirens or handcuffs. It came quietly, the way real accountability usually does. It arrived in the form of registered letters, frozen assets, and the heavy, suffocating silence of a house that had once been loud with lies. 1 week later, I sat at my desk at work. It was the same desk I had occupied for 5 years. The same dual monitor setup. The same ergonomic mouse. The same view of the city skyline through the glass wall. But the gravity in the room had changed. The air felt thinner, cleaner, easier to breathe. My colleagues treated me the same, which was its own kind of relief. They asked about my weekend. They complained about the coffee in the break room. They worried about project deadlines. They had no idea that in the span of 7 days, I had dismantled a dynasty. To them, I was just Adalyn, the senior analyst who had taken a few personal days. I took a sip of my coffee. It was hot. It was bitter. It was perfect. I opened my personal email on my phone. There were no new messages from my father. There were no demands from my mother. There were no threats from Lena. The silence was absolute. I knew, through the grapevine of cousins, who had finally stopped being afraid of being cut off, what was happening. The house was on the market. For sale. Sign now stood at the end of the long driveway, a stark admission of defeat. The asking price was high. But everyone knew it was a distress sale. The proceeds would go directly to Uncle Paul and Aunt Helen. My father had signed the agreement to avoid prosecution. He had traded his legacy for his freedom. Lena had lost the convertible. The dealership had repossessed it on a Tuesday morning, towing it away while the neighbors watched from behind their curtains. I heard she had taken a job at a boutique in the mall. It was a job she had once mocked as being beneath her. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy when I heard that. I just felt a quiet sense of correction. The universe was balancing the books. My mother had sent one final message, 3 days ago. It wasn't an apology. It was a question. She asked if I was happy. I hadn't responded. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. I realized that the question itself was flawed. It wasn't about happiness. It was about safety. It was about ownership. For 30 years, I had been a tenant in my own life, paying rent in the form of obedience. Waiting for a landlord who would never fix the leaking roof. I had believed that if I just worked harder, if I just fixed enough problems, if I just stayed quiet enough, I would eventually earn the deed. But love isn't a lease. You don't earn it. You don't pay for it. And you certainly don't get invoiced for it. I looked at the folder on my desktop. The audit. It contained everything. The spreadsheets. The bank records. The timeline of the betrayal. It was the weapon I had used to cut myself free. But holding on to it now felt unnecessary. It was a relic of a war that was already won. I realized then that I didn't hate them. Hate requires energy. Hate is a connection. What I felt was distance. I felt the kind of polite indifference you feel for strangers you once knew in a past life. They were just people now, flawed, desperate, dangerous people who no longer had my phone number. I wasn't disowned. I was released. I clicked on the folder. I dragged it to the trash bin, icon in the corner of the screen. The computer asked me for confirmation. Are you sure you want to permanently delete these items? I didn't hesitate. I didn't flinch. Yes. I clicked the button. There was a soft, digital crunching sound, and the folder vanished. The screen was clean. The desktop was empty, save for the work I actually wanted to do. I sat back in my chair and spun it slightly, looking out at the city. The sun was shining on the glass buildings, reflecting a million different possibilities. I had a job. I had an apartment. I had a positive net worth, however small, and for the first time in my life, my balance was 0. I owed nothing. I was owed nothing. I turned back to my monitor, opened a new project file, and began to type.